Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, Charles, and congratulations on a really compelling, incredibly eye-opening, and wonderful documentary.
Thank you.
Maybe you could just start by telling me, the Watergate scandal, that period in time, the journalism that went on, revealing that scandal, has been covered so many times on the big screen. What made you want to retell the story, but in your own way, in this documentary form?
Well, I guess one thing that I would say in response is that actually most of Watergate hadn't been covered on the big screen. Of course, there have been films about Watergate, All the President's Men being the most obvious and I think probably the best. And it's a great film. I love the film, and it's a great book too, but that only covers about 2% of what happened. So a lot of other stuff happened, which maybe a Hollywood director would consider less dramatic, I don't know, but which I thought was interesting and important, and that I wanted to show.
And Steven Spielberg said when he interrupted making Ready Player One to make the post, he felt a sense of urgency just because something that was happening right now with Trump, with lots of things, the war on the media, that now seemed like a very relevant time to revisit some of the stuff that happened then. Do you feel that relevance as well? And what do you think the film has to say about our current state?
I certainly do feel the relevance, and there are many parallels. And therefore, of course, the film has many things to say about our current state. But at the same time, in a way, it has nothing to say about our current state, by which I mean I did not bias the film as a function of what's going on now. I wanted to make a film that was accurate about what happened then, and of course there are many parallels between then and now, but I wanted to leave that for the viewer to figure out for themselves. Yeah.
You've taken such a unique approach to documentary. There's this kind of layering of footage, taking the real tape recordings, then reconstructing those. How did you decide on this approach, and how did you go about putting this together to make it fit together in such a fluid way?
I read the transcripts of and listened to many of the recordings, and I thought about using the tapes themselves in the film, and that's possible, but it would have been painful. Painful for me and also painful for the viewer, because the tapes are of very poor quality, and often they're quite rambling and ungrammatical, and people talk over each other, and they're hard to understand. So it would have been difficult to put 45 minutes of that into a film. And so I thought, for purposes of clarity, what I would do is I would edit the transcripts into a coherent script without changing anything. I didn't change anything, I didn't add anything, but what I did do was I only selected those places where people spoke grammatically and where they made their point in a relatively direct way, and I cut out a lot of extraneous stuff. And so the result, I hope, is easy to understand.
One of the things that's so amazing is really hearing from a lot of the real people. You've managed to interview so many of the characters involved.
Yes.
So were any of those moments particularly challenging? Maybe when you're asking people to kind of go back and admit the mistakes they made in quite kind of brazen fashion. And then there were also some people who, I think Henry Kissinger refused to be interviewed. So, did any of that frustrate you in the process, that you weren't able to get all the people you wanted?
Well, of course, I would have enjoyed being able to ask Henry Kissinger some very embarrassing questions. The same is true also of another less important person. Donald Segretti is still around, and I spoke with him off the record. He told me several lies off the record, and of course, intelligently, from his point of view, didn't agree to be interviewed. The other complicated character who did agree to be interviewed was John Dean. John Dean has spent the last 40 years trying to persuade people that he did what he did out of a sense of ethics, and I came to the conclusion that that wasn't quite true. That actually his main motivation was staying out of jail. And he had come to the conclusion, I think absolutely correctly, that if he hadn't gone to the prosecutors and told what he knew, that he would have been the next guy to go down, and that in fact he would have been the fall guy. And I think that it was purely out of self-interest that he did what he did.
One of the things when watching it as well is it's just so compelling, so enthralling, and a lot of it you just can't believe is actually true. But the fact that, you know, it's all based there in the evidence, in the recordings, it's all accurate.
Yep.
Was that something that even took you by surprise in the making of it? Like, this is stranger than fiction, but, you know, this really happened.
Yes, my jaw fell open many times in the course of going through the transcripts and understanding what had happened. And many of the most amazing, stunning things are not in the film, to my disappointment. Richard Nixon, on a fairly regular basis, would kind of go crazy and say things and tell his subordinates to do things that were, you know, really kind of nuts. There was, for example, there was a professor at MIT who's still there, actually, Noam Chomsky, who was a very vocal opponent of the Vietnam War. And Richard Nixon's response was to tell John Ehrlichman to find a way to shut down MIT. And Richard Nixon said this more than once. It wasn't just, you know, a momentary thought. You know, again and again, several times, he went back to Ehrlichman and said, you know, have you figured out a way to force MIT to close down? And, you know, that's a little nuts. MIT was already a very big place, and also, by the way, there was a part of MIT that was responsible for designing the guidance systems of all of America's intercontinental missiles. So shutting down MIT wouldn't have been a particularly smart idea.
You know, Inside Job, Oscar-winning documentary, really did kind of expose a lot of things people didn't want to be shown to the world.
Bad behavior.
And in the same way, I'm sure there's so much in here that people who are still around don't want people to know about. Do you ever feel like concerned about backlash, and what do you want the impact of this film to be?
Well, I certainly want people to think about the current day and whether the same thing might happen again, and if it does, how they and their representatives in Congress will behave. I certainly hope people think about that. I haven't had too much backlash, but there has been some. I'm not going to go into details now, but there have been some people who were not excited about this film being distributed, and that has had some impact. And I may or may not feel the need to speak about that.
And very quickly, can you tell us what topic you might take on next?
Well, several people have suggested that it might be Mr. Trump. I don't know. I haven't decided what I'm going to do next.
Okay. Well, we look forward to it, whatever it is. Thanks so much for your time, and congratulations again on a really compelling, incredible documentary.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.